As the war of words between NATO and the Kremlin intensifies, so too is the number of Russian airspace violations, from drone incursions over Poland, Sweden and Denmark to MiG-31 fighter jets entering Estonian airspace. NATO's response was fast and unanimous. Estonia asked for urgent consultations under Article 4 of the Washington Treaty, and Operation Eastern Sentry was launched, sending dozens of European jets, including RAF Typhoons, to defend Poland's border with Russia. But why didn't the Italian F-35s that were sent to intercept the Russian MiGs shoot them down? Why were they allowed to stay in Estonian airspace for 12 minutes before slipping back across the border? It's the fourth time this year Russia has breached Estonian airspace. It's reminded many people of 2015 when Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian Su-24 bomber that had crossed briefly from Syria into Turkish airspace.
Today's event was a stab in the back by the accomplices of terrorists.
The Kremlin protested loudly, but in the end did nothing. There are, of course, clear differences. That shoot-down order came direct from Ankara. It was purely a Turkish decision. Estonia, on the other hand, has no combat jets of its own and has to rely on NATO. And that complicates things. NATO's protocols are different, particularly because the Italian jets involved are deployed in Estonia on an air policing mission. So what would it take for a NATO jet to actually shoot down a Russian aircraft? What are the rules of engagement? And will they need to change to reflect what seems like a deliberate attempt by the Kremlin to keep raising the stakes? At the heart of the issue is NATO's definition of hostile intent versus hostile act. It's the difference between these two concepts that ultimately determines how NATO responds. NATO defines hostile intent as an action that poses a likely and identifiable threat. A Russian jet crossing into Alliance airspace and not responding to radio calls would fit this definition. But this is where it gets more tricky. NATO jets, as they did over Estonia, can't go straight to lethal action. They first have to try radio calls, signals, and escorting the aircraft out of the area. A hostile act, on the other hand, is something that's both intentional and puts NATO personnel in danger. It's a much higher bar, but when it's reached, NATO forces are allowed to take preemptive action. In the case of the Russian jets over Estonia, the Italian F-35s could easily have shot them down. The Russian jets had switched off their transponders and didn't respond to Estonian air traffic control. But the MiGs were only loaded with R-73 air-to-air missiles, not any sort of bombs or ground attack missiles. Therefore, the threat was deemed to be within tolerance.
And as no immediate threat was assessed here in this case, shooting down the MiGs was not necessary. And of course, what we will always do is to make sure that we react in a proportionate way. But if necessary, you can be assured we will do what is necessary to defend our cities, our people, our infrastructure.
But who would actually give the order anyway? Well, the jets on Operation Eastern Sentry fall under NATO control. As such, the rules of engagement are set down by the Alliance and ultimately SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, a job always given to a senior American officer. But here things are a bit fuzzy. Firstly, the rules of engagement are always kept secret to keep the Russians guessing. And secondly, each individual nation can put its own caveats on those rules. For lower-level responses, countries will usually permit SACEUR to make the call. But if an RAF Typhoon pilot, for instance, was asked to shoot down a Russian drone, it's pretty certain that decision would go to the upper levels of the UK government. And that's for a drone. The decision to shoot down a piloted Russian jet, with all the diplomatic and military fallout that would bring, would definitely be one for national governments to make. So is that likelihood increasing? Well, there is growing evidence that European NATO members are losing patience with Vladimir Putin. At the UN, Poland's foreign minister was blunt. If Russian planes or drones stray into Polish airspace, they'll be shot down.
I have only one request to the Russian government. If another missile or aircraft enters our space without permission, deliberately or by mistake, and gets shot down, and the wreckage falls on NATO territory, please don't come here to whine about it. You have been warned.
The Czech President Petr Pavel has also said the alliance needs to be firmer, as has Lithuania's defence minister. And the Swedes too say they will shoot down Russian fighter jets that violate Swedish airspace. Russian pilots, though, are clever at just pushing far enough. They only fly a few miles into NATO territory, so they're close enough to race back into international airspace when they see NATO jets approaching. So what will the alliance's response be longer term? As former senior RF commander Air Marshal Greg Bagwell wrote on social media, what are the alliance's red lines? As the Kremlin continues to test NATO, will the rules of engagement have to be tightened? Will NATO jets be allowed to fire warning shots or fly closer to Russian warplanes? Critics say Vladimir Putin is taunting the alliance. Turkey's decisive action a decade ago, they say, proof that Russia only understands force and sees de-escalation as weakness. At some point, sooner rather than later, they argue, NATO will need to act and shoot down Putin's planes. Simon Newton, BFBS Forces News. Thanks for watching. For more from BFBS Forces News, like and subscribe to our channel.